Okay. So, good. Bye. Yeah. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Azza Mustafa. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Humanities in Africa, and I welcome you all to the second session of Huma's Book Lunch series. The Book Lunch is a forum of acknowledgement and a critical engagement with work being produced in and on the African continent. We particularly look at books that are relevant to Huma's intellectual agenda and research focus. So the Book Lunch will provide a space for critical discussions of the books we select with the authors. And afterwards, we will have a session of discussion and a Q&A session. Today's author guest is Tinashe Mushakavanhu. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Because, so Tinashe is a Zimbabwean-born writer and a scholar with a PhD in English from the University of Kent in the UK. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the WIT Institute for Social and Economic Research in South Africa. He's also the co-founder of the Fugitive Collective Black Chalk and Co., whose mission is to engender a new culture and a new force of publishing and creative production. The title of his talk today is A Ghost Has Rights Too, the paradox of Dambudzo. Sorry, I'm really bad with names. I mean, please, all my Zimbabwean fellows forgive me, but it's Dambudzo, sorry.
Yeah, Dambudzo Marechera.
Yes, thank you very much. The post-death legacy. So the talk today is based on his recent book, Reincarnating Marechera's Notes on a Speculative Archive, which is published by Activism Press in 2020. Our discussant for today is Ralph Borland, who is a junior research fellow at the Institute for Humanities in Africa. So Ralph is an artist, a curator, and an interdisciplinary knowledge worker. He has a degree in fine arts from the UCT and a master's in telecommunications from New York University. He also holds a PhD from Trinity College Dublin, and his research interest is on the African city and on North-South knowledge inequalities, the democratization and creative use of emerging technologies, African robots, and he's also having a collaboration with streetwire artists in South Africa, introducing electronics and mechanics to their practice. So today we are really expecting a very creative discussion, and we are all looking forward to. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Tinashe to tell us more about his book. Thank you very much. Hello? Could you mute yourself? Yeah,
okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm gonna try and share my screen. Yeah, so thank you everyone at Huma for inviting me to speak about my work on Dambudzo Marechera. So the talk is essentially anchored on a book that I published last year called Reincarnating Marechera, Notes on a Speculative Archive. But as I speak today, I'll also be reading from my forthcoming book, which is going to be published soon by Jacana Media. So yeah, so I will not indicate when I get into the book, but somehow I will be referencing to the new work, but also speaking to the old work. And there's a method to that rhyme. So I think I'll start talking about the title. It's A Ghost Has Rights Too. It's a title that is inspired by Marechera himself. He grapples so intensely with his literary heritage, given the scope of his reading interests. He was also reading books by those writers who had tried in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to get into that subconscious region, a region where he says a ghost has rights too. For instance, he writes, for instance, Charles Bukowski. I was reading his poems, his short stories, his novels. And of course, before that, I'd been reading American writers like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, the Beat Generation, poets and novelists, and the kind of offbeat early 60s outlook of J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye had influenced me. And also the kind of writers like Hermann Hesse, who try very much to seek alternative ways of seeing, of living, of being, of feeling, of emotion. Because after all, we've got eyes, yes, but we also see only what we are taught to see. And it takes a peculiar talent to actually force upon an individual, the reader, let's say, such an overpowering vision of seeing that invisibility becomes visible. And that's what I was trying to say. Marechera's wide literary purview means that he was acquainted with the reigning aesthetic debates. He was attracted to approaches to writing that reflect the tension between tradition and the individual talent. This dialectic is important to Marechera and cracks open his worldview and allows him to forge a new vocabulary, a new language to describe the post-colonial reality. His exposure to all these writers enables his attempts at literary experimentation, an experimental spirit which would continue to the very end of his life. In general, Marechera's aesthetic anxieties work ethic are generously extended to his community, as well as his talents as a literary agent. It is in his efforts to act as an editor and literary agent that we see how the precepts of popular taste and socio-historical norms exerted a censoring pressure. Marechera takes a pragmatic approach to the publishing industry, which I'll talk about later. Oops. What I will not be doing today is talking about the book They Called You Dambudzo. I feel that I've spent many years reading this book before it was written, and perhaps as you listen to my talk today, you get glimpses of those readings. But the book I have authority to talk about is my own, which is this one, Reincarnating Marechera, Notes on a Speculative Archive. It's a very small book published in July 2020, which I feel is a teaser that opens a 3-year publishing program. This year, I'll be launching This Man is Dangerous, Dambudzo Marechera's Harare. And in 2022, I'll be releasing a biography of sorts called Inventing Dambudzo Marechera. Then I'm going to retire as a Marechera scholar. Dambudzo Marechera contains multitudes. A consistent question I'm often asked is, why are you interested in Dambudzo Marechera? And that question leads me to another question. What is my ethical responsibility in this work? I'm cognizant that I study the life of a human being who lived and walked this earth. I care about his humanity, his dignity, and I try to sensitively communicate that through my readings, interpretations, performances. Dambudzo Marechera is not just an intellectual subject or an archive, but an interlocutor and collaborator whose ideas inspire, provoke, enrage, but in the end provide generative ways of engaging the world. What you see on the screen is his birth certificate. So his birth names were Charles William Marechera. Dambudzo is his nickname. So I talk a little bit about that in my writing projects. And the picture that you see, that baby, is Dambudzo Marechera when he was 3 months old. After the Lancaster House Conference and the announcement of the new Zimbabwe, there was a rush to return home. Many of the Zimbabweans who had been exiled by the war were coming back to build the new country. They were joined by many from the Black diaspora, people from the Caribbean, the US, and elsewhere. Would Dambudzo Marechera had voluntarily returned to Zimbabwe if Channel 4 television had not approached him to do a film about himself? Nobody really knows. The appeal to be a star in a film about himself was too good to resist for Marechera. He was going to be paid for the work and get a free return ticket to his homeland that he had left a decade ago. when it was another country and under colonial rule. The moment of arrival is captured on camera, the moment he emerges from Air Zimbabwe and walks a few steps before kneeling to kiss the ground. He is home. Before this figure who emerges, the identity of Marechera was a mythic abstraction. Nobody in Harare had met him, but it did not take long for Marechera to fall out with the film crew. What exactly happened? For Marechera, the film was a honey trap that tricked him out of exile. The lure was for him to turn up. Nothing was really planned. His moment of arrival is captured on film. The effect depends on a certain distance, one rendered literally through Marechera's geographic removal from Zimbabwe, and figuratively through the enigmatic quality of his disembodied notoriety. Marechera's double movement that has driven this book towards clarifying something vital that was formerly mystified, establishing some emphatically solid ground on which he belonged. The film has become a template for understanding his future appearance. He is not an apparition, but the film also does something. It creates a spectacle of the man. So even the film is not objective, even when the figure we see is Marechera. These uncanny effects, redolent of nostalgia, but also of trauma, are intense central to the experience of fascination. They're clues to our intuition that what produces the fascinating text is in turn produced by it as a compulsion to repeat, a primal psychic economy. Since we encounter Marechera's image in advance, in innuendo and speculation, the priority of origins is lost together with any chance of an objective viewpoint, so that Marechera is doomed to appear in terms of loss. He falls short of the image of himself and is less impressive than it because his impression is visible as an already circulating image. So yeah, anyway, one of the things I talk about in Reincarnating Marechera is Marechera's family. So in May 1987, his sister, Tsitsi Marechera, was blown by a bomb that had been, by a parcel bomb that was sent. She was married to an ANC comrade. And I think the most popular image that circulates about this incident is kind of the post-bomb photo op for Mugabe when he goes to pay his condolences. So in the image, you can see Mugabe. This is Marechera on the far left, and the current president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was at the time the Minister of Security. This is an incident that is underplayed in the Marechera scholarship that I've been fascinated with. So in my forthcoming book, I spend a little bit of time thinking about that episode and Marechera's own sort of family relations. When the incident took place in May 1987, it was covered sort of in the international news, but the narrative was a bit sketchy, so you don't get a lot of the story apart from the bomb. But it also featured in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in the actual report, there is a section about Marechera's sister, and this is a screenshot from a video that I found with the sister and one of her children who survived the bomb blast. One of the concepts I am thinking about, that I've been thinking about a lot, is Marechera's friendships and their generative influence in his life and in his idea of a writer. Much has been written on how he's alienated from everyone and everything. And I'm hoping through this, we can read him differently. I've also been looking at his friendship, for example, with Louis Nkosi. So that's an image of Louis Nkosi and Marechera at one of the lectures he was giving in Harare. There is a near universal claim that there is a single Marechera archive, and that archive, an archive that is spoken for and therefore to insist on its multiplicities is sacrilegious. I want to argue that there are many archives of Marechera that have been completely ignored, and those inform my work. These alternative archives, I state them, I evoke them, I meditate with them, I dialogue with them, and in this way explore and expose the limitations of the prevailing scholarship. The fact of the matter is that writers such as Charles Mgoshi, Musaya Marazimunya, Stanley Nyamfukuza, Chenjerai Hove, Wilson Katiyo, Tsitsi Dangaremba, Yvonne Vera, among others, are missing and completely ignored in the readings of Marechera. And these were his peers. These were peers he was writing with, reading with, arguing with, dreaming with, drank with, and in whose houses he sometimes slept in. Harare has always had conservative airs. It operates on the side of morality and decency. It's a city that never provided Marechera with the kinds of friendships he needed. His relationship with the local writing community was antagonistic. They avoided him because friendship with Marechera could make them pariahs, or laden them with that terrible word, controversial. Doors to jobs and opportunities could be slammed. Anyway. So this is just me trying to explain about friendship and Marechera. And in this photo that you see right now, this is Charles Mgoshi and Marechera. On a photo shoot that they were doing for a Dutch magazine that featured them in 1986. The most vivid portrait of Mashotwa Venezia Marechera is unflattering, one by his own son, fictionalized in part in The House of Anger, and subsequently told and retold. Here I should point is when the conflation between fact and fiction becomes problematic in the biographical readings of Marechera, because we all read his fiction as his story. By the age of 35, Mashotwa Venezia Marechera had 9 children, born between 1948 and 1964. So Marechera was the third born, so he had 2 older brothers. When her husband died in 1966, she became a single parent. They were soon evicted from their council house and moved to Tangwena. So one of the things that I tease in Reincarnating Marechera is also the relationship between Marechera and his father. I think it's very important in thinking, in reading him. But I only tease it, but I explain it in subsequent work. The parents, they were soon evicted from their council house and moved to Tangwena. In order to take care of her children, she allegedly turned to prostitution. But there was a family secret the children did not know when they were young or growing up. The parents had an arranged marriage, and it was only discovered later that they were related and should not have been married or together. A ceremony was needed to correct this, but it was never done. A series of bad luck started striking the family, and according to family mythology, the father's death, which was not adequately explained, was part of the narrative, part of the story. Some people suspected that the misfortune, the death was a result of the misfortune. And yeah, I think I'll explain it a little bit more if anyone has a question about that. So one of the other things that fascinates me about Marechera that I've been interested in is his sort of activism. There are people who dismiss that he was an actual activist, student activist, but in 1973, he was one of 6 students that were expelled from the University of Rhodesia for leading protests. So in this image of the front page of the Rhodesia Herald of 7 August 1973, you see the students, and Marechera is pretty much at the back, the sort of bespectacled guy. And the other part that I talk about is So his student activism influences a later generation of student activists. So after he dies, the students at the University of Zimbabwe commemorate Marechera and have public gatherings that were sort of annual, at least for the first 2-3 years after he died. And in this particular image that I'm showing, the person that I'm circling with my, if you can see, is Tendai Biti, who was at the time the Secretary General of the Student Representative Council at the University of Zimbabwe. But there were also other people, I think, like Douglas Monzora, who is now a president of a faction of the MTC. So I've kind of just been interested in the sort of intellectual influence that Marechera has had on a generation of intellectuals, writers, politicians, and activists in Zimbabwe. So I think I'll stop here. Everything that I was sharing is pretty much part of the pamphlet, Reincarnating Marechera, and I'm happy to engage or respond to questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tinashe, for the very interesting, very interesting presentation, and how you managed to bring this very interesting aspect of the life of Marechera that we all looking now forward to the discussion. So I will ask Ralph to unmute yourself, and yes, let's begin.
Great. Thank you very much, Azza and Tinashe. So Tinashe and I met properly at the Cape Town Art Fair just over a year ago, which was one of the last big public kind of occasions, it feels like, in March 2020. And we had a long conversation about Dambudzo Marechera. I was introduced to Dambudzo Marechera's work when I was a teenager in Harare, where I think I got a book of his as a present for a birthday when I was about 15 or something. And it was that slim Baobab Books volume, which has a lot of photographs of Dambudzo Marechera, and also contains this work that I keep returning to, which is the writer interviews himself, in which Dambudzo Marechera conducts a self-interview. And I've used it to teach writing classes before, because I really like that notion of the writer or the artist knowing that the questions that get asked are part of how the narrative gets created. So he interviews himself and he takes both roles. So I was really fascinated to read the extract from your book, and especially the figure of the artist that it paints, or the writer. You emphasize his loneliness and his alienation is part of what you emphasize in that extract, as well as his other capacities that he has. But I was thinking one of maybe the hooks that I'm thinking about in responding to the extract I've read is this figure of the writer and the artist as not belonging, and how that can be very attractive and feeds into this romantic image of the artist, but also is deeply painful for the artist and the writer as well. And the way that we can romanticize that figure, who is this creative, rebellious, uncontainable, bohemian kind of spirit, but also the very painful aspects of what that's like for the person. So artists and writers almost become sacrificial, it sometimes feels like, with their mental health issues and their inability to fit in a neat way. And you mentioned Charles Bukowski as one of the first names you mentioned today when you were talking about reference influences on Marechera. And funnily enough, when I read your extract, he was one of the first names that came to mind as well, because of Bukowski's own life story, having actually quite a few touch points with Marechera's, also coming from a very poor environment, teaching himself how to write, and using writing as a way of making a living and gaining status. But also Bukowski was dogged through his life by alcoholism, and his books talk very honestly about his struggles with alcoholism and not turning up for readings and embarrassing his hosts and breaking relationships. So yeah, perhaps perhaps talking about that sense of the difficulty of belonging. I also read Ralph Ellison last year, Invisible Man, during lockdown. It also struck me how Ralph Ellison, as a writer, also talks about this inability to drink the Kool-Aid. As much as Dambudzo Marechera was an activist, in the end, he found it hard to really be fully aligned with any political position. And I think his response when he gave a rhetorical response to saying, if anybody wants to say that I'm speaking from a particular position for a particular group or a particular nationality, my response is fuck you. So perhaps that as a prompt, Tinashe.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very much interested in sort of the intellectual Marechera. You know, I'm interested in his ideas. I'm interested in what he brings to the conversation. I think that the version of Marechera that circulates, you know, under does not acknowledge his intellectual contributions. You know, I think that he is supposed to be crazy. He is mad. He has nothing positive to say, and I think that when you sort of trace him and spend time in the bars and nightclubs and sort of public spaces that he occupied in a city like Harare, you realize the kinds of influence that he had, and I think that's been the kind of project that I've been interested in, sort of reading Marechera in very specific terms, in very specific locations. And I think part of the work, like, I mean, even with Reincarnating Marechera, it's work that is inspired by sort of the Marechera who returns to Zimbabwe. So the figure that is back and how he is contemplating his role. So he spends a lot of time meditating about what bohemianism means in an African city, or means in African literature. So he's meditating a lot on that. He writes about that in Mind Blast, for example, but also just in unpublished notes that he is writing about himself, how he occupies Harare. For example, he was, by the time he died, he was trying to write this collection of essays about his relationship with Harare, because one of the interesting things is that when people read Marechera, they read him in the context of Harare, and that is a general problem of Zimbabwean literature, that we have increasingly become a one-city country. Everything in Zimbabwe, whether as a point of crisis, as a point of political dysfunctionality, everything points back to Harare. But Marechera, you know, I think one of the interesting things that I've also been working with is that he comes from Rusape, and there's something about Rusape that is actually censored at the point of publication. So the House of Anger, when he submitted it to Heinemann, it was originally called At the Head of the Stream, and two things happened. At the time, after submission of the manuscript, Marechera was in prison, and he was at the brink of being deported back to Zimbabwe. And one of the things that I found is that I found these letters from the lawyers that were representing him. And they felt that anyway, so that the title was changed from At the Head of the Stream to the House of Anger. And it quickly became a political title. For James Carey, it was sexier. At the Head of the Stream, he felt it was going to be difficult to sell a book with that kind of title, so the House of Anger became the title. But in the correspondence with the lawyer, the title became very political, because that's what they used to argue against his deportation back to Rhodesia. But I mean, I talk about that specifically because I found that very interesting, how the erasure of Marechera's interest in the source is quickly censored. And I have been sort of writing about that yeah, if I find my paper next to me, I will read parts of what I've been thinking, because I've been writing a lot about that, and it's mostly informed by sort of the correspondence that I found in the archives, and sort of the notes that James Carey is sharing with his colleagues at Heinemann. But yeah, he is lonely in that when he comes back to Zimbabwe, he can't find people to have the kinds of literary conversation that he can only fantasize about. So all those writers that I mentioned, I think that he begins to have these conversations on his own through his own readings. And there's a way in which he leaves us with a reading program, or at least a program of reading him or engaging with his work after he's gone. And that was kind of the provocation of this title, because he has copious notes about that sort of level of engagement with with other writers, but most of those writers are outside Zimbabwe. But I'm rambling, so I'm happy if people have questions.
That's fine. Thanks, Tinashe. Yeah, the description of changing the title of the book to make it more political, in a sense, more easily readable as political, I think seems like it's part of that way in which he resisted being placed into an easy box politically. So even though he was an activist at university, when he came back to the liberated Zimbabwe in the 80s, he found it hard to be completely on side with the revolution or the state in Zimbabwe. And I think it's part of that way that artists and writers can resist that role. I'm even reminded of Doris Lessing in the same location in the 1950s, who at the time was very committed to the communist world revolution and wouldn't hear criticism of Russian totalitarianism. But as a later writer, she had the chance to reflect more on the complexity of the political positions that she had taken earlier. So yeah. Just maybe as a segue, and we could take some questions and discussion if there is. When you're talking about the rural areas, and he talks about growing up in Rusape and learning to read from books and comics and magazines that were on the town dump, and how, in a sense, his early exposure to information was determined by the white wealthy parts of town, which is where the books and magazines and comics came from. And he talks about that choice of not writing in Shona, which he associated with being in a degraded position, and how he chose to write in English. But that came with its own problems, where he talks about, as a Black writer, he has to have harrowing fights and hair-raising panga duels with the language to make it do what he wants it to do. He relates that as well to feminist writers and how they need to work with language. But in terms of this rural urban relationship, I remember one thing you told me when we chatted a year or so ago was about this post office box that was Marechera's, that was part of a project asking people around Zimbabwe, aspirant writers, to write into Marechera, and how even after his death there would still be letters arriving in that post box, which is also like the start of the extract of your book, where you have this imagery of Marechera in his room and on the phone, taking all of these calls and trying to be of help to all of these aspirant writers from across Zimbabwe, from the rural areas as well as from the city. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about that post office box and that project.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll read an extract from my book. It was in one of my visits to the National Archives of Zimbabwe that I first saw a pink folder, that the real import of Marechera's influence revealed itself. The folder contained a neat pile of hundreds of handwritten letters printed on lined paper, changing color with age. I read the letters one after the other. My researcher's instinct to take notes was forgotten. I was entranced with the discovery of how Marechera was mourned and memorialized. The outpouring of grief quickly turned into demands for freedom of speech and requests for mentorship. His audience consisted of the young who cared little about hero-worshipping political figures and more about social justice and economic advancement. The letters, addressed in care of the Dambudzo Marechera Trust, were dispatched from urban townships, rural areas, growth points, mining compounds, farms, and from far-flung places, places that only appear in the news during election seasons or moments of catastrophe. The post office, with its extensive network of branches, penetrated deep into the hinterland and played a conspicuous role in forming and shaping Marechera's legacy. In depth, Marechera raptures this small view of Zimbabwe, which is often restricted to a little corridor in the middle of the country that starts in Harare and ends in Bulawayo. Marechera is no longer the Marechera trapped. He is the everyman of Zimbabwe, an ordinary person, constantly persecuted by the state and its security apparatus. For his followers, Marechera is a cult hero who stood up to power, and they came to express their frustration that the justice and righteousness he fought for haven't prevailed. The post office box replaces Marechera, and the postage stamp and mailbox therefore catalyze a shift in the reconfiguration of Marechera's new post-death identity. Marechera's name became synonymous with the box number. In fact, the post office box replaced Marechera, and in this form, Marechera became a site of consciousness and a place of memory making. So these are sort of separate excerpts from my Reincarnating Marechera. I think, what I found interesting was that all these young people, some of the young people were writing directly to Marechera. So the trustees of the Marechera Trust at the very beginning were his brother, Namo Marechera, and Flora Witwald, and Hugh Lewin. So there was a way in which these trustees became proxies. So the young people that were writing to this post office box were interested in communicating their messages directly to Marechera, and somehow they expected him to respond. And so the trust was just like inundated with all these letters that were coming from all these places. But I mean, the letters, nobody has really done much. I think a few of them are accepted in the source book, which is kind of this biographical project that exists. But other than that, the letters have just been ignored. And that's part of what I've been, that's part of what I've been very excited about in the work that I've been doing. But I mean, I think I also wanted to read, so I want to go back to House of Anger. Toni Morrison writes that the act of imagination is bound up with memory. You know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use, but in fact, it is not flooding. It is remembering where it used to be. All water has perfect memory and is forever trying to get back where it was. Writers are like that, remembering where we were, what valley ran through, what the banks were like, the light that was there, and the route to our original place. It is emotional memory, what the nerves and the skin remember, as well as how it appeared, and the rush of imagination is our flooding. I read this excerpt because water is an ever-present source in Dambudzo Marechera's fiction or his mythology. The presence of water in Marechera's writings appear to be under-researched or ignored, and scholars often treat it as an ancillary to the broader narrative. So his first book, The House of Anger, was, according to the author, written while he was camping near the River Isis in Oxford, and thus water is a source of life in Marechera's body of work. This is evident in House of Anger, which he opens with scenes of black protest. And I quote, "All the black youth was thirsty. There was not an oasis of thought we did not lick dry, apart from those which had been banned, whose drinking led to arrests and such like flea scratchings." It is this thirst that permeates throughout the book, which he had originally titled At the Head of the Stream. The title was dropped because, according to the publishers, it was not marketable. So they settled on The House of Anger, a metaphor that would come to define not only post-independent Zimbabwe, but also Marechera's post-legacy death. It seems no coincidence that water's involvement in the decision to frame Marechera's fiction subconsciously reflects a long history of structural racism. But this search for the source also partly informs the composition of the book itself. When and how the book was written has become part of the mythology of Marechera. After his expulsion from Oxford, Marechera's life as a homeless wanderer began. The House of Hunger emanated from this crisis. He camps at the banks of river Isis. But yeah, anyway, I just wanted to talk about water. Like I've been thinking a lot about water in relation to the House of Hunger and the level of violence that change of the title affected, which actually takes us to the rubbish dump that you referred to, Ralph, because I've been interested in this community that is displaced from the source that Marechera is alluding to in his title. But yeah, I can talk more about it later.
So thank you very much, Tinashe, for the response, and thank you, Ralph, for the discussion. And now we open the floor for any questions directed to Tinashe or Ralph, or yes. What we prefer is to people raise the hand or write in the chat, and yeah. So the floor is open for questions and answers and comments. Okay, we have Ranka. So we ask you to unmute yourself.
Hi, can people hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, thanks for that, Tinashe and colleagues. I was just thinking, this is just a spur of the moment thought. One of my favorite parts of your booklet, Tinashe, is the part in the back where you have letters directed to you by various intellectual and literary figures to whom you have corresponded about their link to Marechera. So when you mentioned water, I remembered the lovely letter, generous letter that China Mieville sent you about the influence Marechera's had on his work. And just now when you said water, I would be really grateful for any of your thoughts, no matter how scattered, on the link between Marechera's work, the Black Sunlight, I think, is the primary text, and the Scar by Mieville, if you had any.
Yeah, thank you, Ranka, for the comment or question and question. Yeah, I mean, I think I decided to include the sort of my personal archive, reaching out to people about Marechera, because I was just curious about what people really remember. I think for me, that was kind of the exercise. It's mostly people that appear, that feature in sort of the writings and the remembering of Marechera. And so people that I had access to, I would send emails, and I was just curious whether they remember the same things or they remember new things. So that's kind of where this exercise came from in retrospect. I think I wasn't necessarily thinking about that at the very beginning. But yeah, I think with China Mieville, I was very fascinated with, I've been fascinated with his kind of thinking, with his sort of speculative writing, and sort of how much it is inspired by Marechera, because in a way that's been how I've been trying to read him as Marechera is a speculative writer. So not necessarily thinking about sort of the realist or the sort of political commentator. I've always been trying to figure out what does it mean to call Marechera a prophet, or in the ways that people use that sort of title, and yeah, I think China, at least from the conversations I have had with him when I met him in person, and sort of just in the exchanges I've had with him, I think Marechera facilitated sort of that an intellectual speculation that he sort of builds on his own, that he was already doing anyway in his work. and that you could recognize from Marechera's writing program. And I think that's also kind of what I'm increasingly interested in, sort of that speculative reading of Marechera that is beyond the time that the literature is generated from.
Thanks.
So I have, Claire wrote in the chat and she said, I have no questions, just a comment that this has been a fascinating and I would love to read the book. Thank you. So
I think I've just been sent a question, so I'm gonna try and answer that. So it's kind of connected. I've been asked a question about water. I wanted to, from Zamambo. It's a question about, I wanted to ask, do you think the use of water was also alluding to spirituality? As Africans, water is also culturally meaningful and spiritual to us. I mean, I think to a large extent, yes. I've been thinking a lot about the river, the Rusape River. When I started thinking about that question, about the original title of the House of Hunger, you know, I think that there's a way in which the new title forces a kind of drought. So when I talk about the sort of structural racism that happens, like in this piece that I've been writing about, I'm actually thinking about the role of rivers in the colonial project, sometimes when I'm doing these things, I feel like I'm being very speculative. But I was very excited that another writer from Rusape, Robert Muponde, has just published a book called The Scandalous Times of a Book Louse, and which is also largely set in Rusape. And the first two chapters are also very much thinking about water. So they're thinking about the Rusape River, the Rusape Dam. And so for me, there's a sort of, I think it's been forcing me to reread Marechera, to think about that kind of spirituality, cultural identity, the relationship between water and sort of some African communities, So I think there is something generative about water and the House of Hunger. So this new title forces a kind of drought. So dry is this river that existed, that Marechera was meditating with. Okay, so Teacher Muvuti says, I'm a bit curious to know what you mean by you feel like you read they called you Dambudzo before it was written. That she say nothing new or, well, I mean, I've spent the last 12 years of my life engaging with Marechera, the Marechera archives, talking to people who knew Marechera, so I feel parts of it. Parts of it for me are not new. There are fascinating things that the book brings. But yeah, I think at some point I'll share my thoughts about the book. But I just don't feel like talking about that book. So, but yeah. I think it's important. I think anyone who's interested in Marechera should read the book and make their own opinion. I think that, anyone who's interested in Marechera should read it for the lessons, both negative and positive, and make their own opinion.
Now we have Amina. I will invite you to ask your question, and please could you unmute yourself, Amina?
Yes, thank you so much, Tinashe, for this wonderful and generous book talk. I found myself thinking about the position of the title and Marechera, A Ghost Has Right Too. And with my previous work, I've been thinking a lot about ghosts in relation to who we are, and ghosts in relation to the past, and also ghosts as metaphors that tie sensations and with whom we tie bodily sensations and correspondence. And I'm curious, Tinashe, to hear about how you relate your body to the ghost of Marechera as you've walked this journey, thinking with him, perhaps replotting the archive and being in his presence, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's an interesting question. You know, it's been fascinating to work with Marechera. You know, there has been a lot of violence, you know, along the journey. People are very possessive of the archive. I've been grabbed by the collar. I've been spitted. I've been called names. I've been sent threatening messages when I've written about Marechera. I remember when I started my PhD, some people would write. I remember receiving messages that, "Who do you think you are to go to school to study Marechera? You know, you're ignorant," and those kinds of things. So it's been fascinating, you know, to work on Marechera as a subject and to sort of see how different people engage with him. For me, those are forms of reading. But I've also been lucky to meet people, like older people, some people who of his generation, you know, who talk about Marechera in very spiritual terms, you know, like how they think, what they think my spirit and his spirit, whether they are communicating or agreeing or disagreeing. So I've had those kinds of intense spiritual conversations with people who are much older than myself, and that's been fascinating because I've never considered it in that sense. But I've been learning. I think it's been a process of self-discovery for myself, when I did my PhD was on Marechera and Shelley, so it was also very interesting to be working with these kind of two ghosts who were kind of not similar but also similar. And so I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I was speaking to one of my colleagues, and they were sort of commenting on the title as well, and they said to me, "Oh, you know, you're talking about a ghost as opposed to an ancestor," and so there are all these sort of readings about that are about the word ghost that are generative. And I think in Marechera's use was in sort of presenting us with a reading program of how he wanted us to engage with this archive in a more active sense, and in the ways that he has been engaging with these other archives of writers that he admires or whose stories mirror his own. And so there is something generative about it, and that I'm trying to figure out in my rereadings of the material of the Marechera archive, if you like.
So yes, thank you very much. I don't see any other question in the chat or a hand up.
I could maybe just draw attention back to the book extract for this the seminar, because there's something that's been in my mind, which is the idea of Marechera almost like trying to do bureaucratic work, which I was like, why did that word bureaucracy come to me? But at the beginning of the book extract, you quote Marechera talking about spending 4.5 days as a literary agent and feeling the demands of all these people who need his help. And then at the end of the extract, you talk about the people who are suffering from the effects of the war. And it says the government bureaucrats were unconcerned, and Marechera decided to be the story doctor who provided an outlet for these young people to vent their pent-up emotions. And I think what's striking me about it is his struggle to move between those positions that he's in, of the artist and the writer who suffers himself, and then also to try and be something for other people as well. And this vision of him spending his 4.5 days in an uncarpeted room and being at the disposal of other people and being a vessel for other people's needs. So yeah, I think there's something interesting there. And if he hadn't died as young as he had done, and if he'd gone on, I wonder where he would have gotten to in terms of struggling with those different responsibilities, being the writer himself and then being something for others as well.
I mean, I think it's a question that I keep thinking about. I think I could see him in different spaces. In Harare, I could see him being swarmed by people as he was in the 80s. I think that he would have remained an important source of political debate. Because I mean, one of the most interesting things about him is that he went to school with some of these people. He knows them personally, whether from high school, from exile, from university, from sort of different spaces. So these are not figures that he just reads in the news or sees on TV or other people just talking about. They know each other. I mean, one of the most fascinating sort of episodes is at the very first Zimbabwe International Book Fair in 1983, where he's heckling Edison Zobko, who was a very interesting character in himself. They're also, I mean, Zobko and Marechera have occupy pretty much the same space in the imagination of Zimbabweans. Zobko was a very interesting lawyer, but he was being heckled by Marechera and he could not take that. And he ordered that Marechera be pretty much removed out of circulation. So for the duration of the first book fair, Marechera spent the rest of it in prison because they didn't want him to embarrass them any further. And so when he's heckling some of these people, he's heckling people that he knows personally, and there can only be one powerful figure in the room, or one charismatic figure, or one interesting person. But yeah, I mean, the relationship with the war veterans, I think it's a preoccupation he has. He's just surprised that 2 years after or 3 years after he's back, soon after independence, that nothing is being done directly for the war veterans who have just returned back from the war, and that is sort of the basis of Mind Blast and sort of his engagement with the city. Because most of the people, one of the books I've just been reading recently, it's called Children of War, and it's in that book. It says that the people who were fighting for the liberation in Zimbabwe were between the ages of 13 and 24. Those were the people. So these were people who skipped the border, who absconded school to form the sort of armies that were fighting for the liberation of Zimbabwe. So these were people who were not yet teenagers or adults, and they had to spend all of their time, fighting for this idealistic vision of a country. But as soon as that vision was realized, they were completely ignored. They were expected to grow up quickly and become nation builders. And there's a way in which Marechera sort of pokes fun at that in Mind Blast. And again, I mean, it fascinates me. Like, if we were to read that and we go to sort of 10 years later, when the war veterans threaten Mugabe's hold on power, and that leads to the farm invasions, there's kind of a genealogy. So Marechera could already see sort of these agitations that would come later. He sort of preempts them in sort of that interest in those people. But I mean, as he's doing that, I mean, I just don't have time, but one of the things that he's doing with the writing clinic is that the very stories he's interested in, that becomes the publishing program in Zimbabwe. So the war narratives start emerging at the very end of the 80s. And Baobab, which was one of the preeminent publishers in Zimbabwe, spends a lot of time republishing those war narratives. And some of the people they were publishing were the people that had visited Marechera at the writing clinic. And I found that very, very interesting. And some of them became well-known journalists or sort of intellectuals who do interesting things. Yeah, I don't know how much time we have, but I'll just try.
There's still one question on the chat. I mean, we can just probably respond to it quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so during my introduction, I mentioned Dambudzo's mother. Dambudzo's mother as a sex worker and other accounts allegedly accused his mother of using muti against him, witchcraft. Can you reflect on the breakdown of this relationship? Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's there's an interesting narrative. The story is that the mother was not supposed to be married because she was possessed with a great-grandmother who had been doing bad deeds in their village, and apparently that grandmother this is in the 1890s. She was then banned by the people, and then her spirit moved into Dambudzo's mother. And then she got married, and she was not supposed to get married. And the only way to redress that was for her to pick one of her children. And apparently she picked Dambudzo. And so there's sort of archival documents that I've recently been reading from one of Marechera's brothers. So this is a family secret that the children get to learn as they grow older. And I think with Marechera, he kind of also learns it much later, like the actual intensity of it. I think he actually gets to learn about it later, and then his resentment for his mother is just sort of permanent, and they never get to meet. I think the mother only visits him at the very end, when he's hospitalized just before he died. That was the last time the mother would see her son. But when he returned from Zimbabwe, he refused to meet her. When he was sort of moving around the city, he didn't want to meet with her. So that sort of, there was a permanent fracture that happened between mother and son. But I mean, like what I also mentioned earlier, there was something about Marechera's own relationship with his own father. There isn't much detail, but from what I have been sort of piecing together, he was very attached to his father, and his father's death when he's 11 is also very traumatic for him. And I think that all these sort of episodes and events in his life are so interconnected that they affect how he behaves, how he decides to interact with the world, and maybe even informs some of his thinking about family and relationships. Yeah.
Okay, I think now we are coming to the end of the session, and we really need to thank you, Tinashe, for this very interesting discussion. Yes, I mean, you are always welcome back to Huma, when the new book is coming out. So we also expect that we have another session, a launch session for the book. So yes, this is the end of our session today, and thank you everyone for being here. And next week, we also, on Monday, on the 17th, we have Mahmoud Mamdani, book Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. And we hope to see you all again next Monday. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Azar.
Yeah, Ralph?
I just said thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean,